They said she was cursed, a barren woman worth less than a cow. Her parents, ashamed and hungry for silver, sold her to a man who didn't want a wife so much as a body to break. For a year she lived under his roof, treated like a mule that couldn't pull its weight. But fate has a way of turning cruel into stranger still. The night she finally broke free, she stumbled into the path of a cowboy, with 5 children gripping his hands and coat sleeves. A man who didn't come looking for her, yet chose her all the same. Folks whispered he'd lost his mind. They had no idea what storm was about to roll through that town, or what secret Clara carried that would test every bond she was about to build. The year was 1886. A hard summer in the Wyoming Territory. Dust stuck to the skin like second hide, and water was worth near as much as gold. Clara was 19 that July. But she looked younger, thin arms, sunburnt cheeks, eyes too soft for the sharp world around her. Her parents had long since given up on calling her a blessing. By the time she turned 16, neighbors whispered she wasn't right. Married couples had tried her with midwives and herbs, old prayers and cruel talk. No swelling belly, no crying babe. That was enough for her parents to stamp her fate. "She's barren," her mother said one evening at the supper table, voice flat as the bread on their plates, "and we can't keep feeding a mouth that won't give back." Her father didn't argue. He just looked at Clara with the same expression he gave a dying calf, tired, disappointed, already turning away. 2 weeks later she was sold. His name was Harlan Boone, a trader older than her father. He reeked of whiskey and sweat, his boots worn smooth from years of gambling more than working. Clara became his wife by law but never by love. "You'll do what you're told," he said the first night, voice thick with drink. "You'll cook, you'll clean, and maybe God'll change his mind and put some use in you yet." He treated her with the same careless cruelty he gave his horses. A backhand when supper was cold, a sneer when the neighbors glanced too long at her. Nights filled with silence except when anger rose, and still, no child. Harlan's patience thinned like thread in the wind. He began calling her names worse than barren, curse, bad luck, waste of God's clay. Once, when drunk enough, he spat in her face and told her she'd die alone in the dirt. Clara learned not to cry where he could see, but inside, something in her hardened, not bitterness, not yet, but a quiet resolve. The night everything changed began like any other. Harlan came home later than usual, staggering, belt unbuckled. His voice slurred but his anger was sharp. "You're no wife of mine," he snarled, shoving her against the wall. "I ought to trade you for a sack of flour." Something in Clara snapped, not wild, not loud, just final. When he passed out at the table, she took her chair. Quietly she packed nothing but a shawl, a worn Bible, and her shoes. She slipped into the night with the moon as her witness, bare feet crunching gravel as she walked into the dark prairie. By dawn she had no strength left, no food, no water, no plan, just a road that cut like a scar across the land. That's when she heard the creak of wagon wheels. The man who stopped for her wasn't a stranger to hardship. His name was Elias Carter, 32 years old, broad-shouldered, hair already flecked with gray. He drove a wagon pulled by 2 tired horses, 5 children packed into the back like chicks huddled in a nest. The oldest boy couldn't have been more than 12. The youngest was still a babe, swaddled in cloth, fussing in the summer heat. Clara froze on the road, dust rising around her like smoke. Elias pulled the reins, studying her with steady eyes. "You lost?" he asked. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to collapse right there. But pride kept her spine straight. No place to be lost from. Elias looked at her a long moment, then at the bruises along her arms, half hidden under the shawl. He didn't press, just climbed down, offered his hand. "You look like you could use a ride," he said. "And I've got mouths to feed that could use another pair of hands." That was the moment the rest of her life pivoted on. A choice as small as nodding her head, or walking on and letting the road finish what Harlan had started. She took his hand. Elias was a widower. His wife, Mary, had died giving birth to their youngest daughter less than a year before. Since then, he'd been holding his family together with little more than grit. The children watched Clara with a mix of fear and curiosity. The oldest boy, Henry, sat stiff as a fence post. The middle girls whispered behind their hands. Only the baby seemed to accept her without question, grasping her finger as if she belonged already. As the wagon rolled on, Clara sat beside Elias, silence heavy between them. She expected questions, where she'd come from, why she looked half dead. None came. Elias just kept the horses steady, eyes fixed on the road, jaw set like a man who knew what it meant to carry more than his share. By the time they reached his homestead, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in fire. Clara looked at the small, weather-worn ranch house, and felt a strange pull. It wasn't home, not yet, but it wasn't Harlan's hell either. That night Clara lay on a cot in a corner of the cabin, listening to the children's soft breathing. For the first time in months, she felt safe. But as she drifted towards sleep, a thought gnawed at her. Nothing in life came free. Why had Elias chosen her, a barren woman with no kin, no dowry, no future? What did he see in her that she couldn't see herself? She didn't know, but she would, because back in town, Harlan Boone had woken to find his property gone, and Harlan wasn't the kind of man to let go without a fight. Clara had escaped one prison, but she was about to discover another truth. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it comes riding hard behind you. Clara woke the next morning to the smell of coffee and frying salt pork. The cabin creaked as Elias moved about, boots heavy on the plank floor. The children were already stirring, their whispers rising like sparrows at dawn. For a moment she didn't move. She stared at the rough-hewn rafters overhead, the sunlight cutting through cracks in the boards. It felt foreign, fragile. Not hers, but it wasn't Harlan's house either, and that alone made her breathe easier. Elias's voice broke through. "Breakfast's ready, if you're hungry." She rose, smoothed her hair with trembling hands, and stepped into the main room. The children sat at the table, wooden bowls clutched in small fingers. Henry, the oldest, glared at her as if she were a thief. The girls giggled nervously, stealing glances. The baby reached out, fat fists waving. Clara slid into an empty chair. The wood groaned beneath her, and every eye turned. Elias set a plate in front of her, then returned to his own seat without comment. No one prayed, no one spoke, just the scrape of spoons and the silence of a family still half strangers to each other. It was clear from the first day that trust would not come easy. Henry, 12, kept watch on her like a guard dog. When she fetched water, he followed. When she fed the baby, his eyes narrowed as though waiting for her to fail. The middle girls, Anna and Ruth, whispered questions Clara could hear but wasn't meant to answer. "Why's she here? Is she staying?" Papa didn't say. Only little Maggie, the second youngest at 5, offered Clara something close to kindness. She toddled after her in the yard, clutching her doll by one limp arm. "You're not Mama," Maggie said once, matter of fact, "but you smell like soap." "I like..." Clara knelt, brushing Maggie's hair from her eyes. "No, I'm not your Mama, but I'll help if you'll let me." The child's small fingers closed around hers, sealing a fragile truce. If Elias had regrets about bringing her home, he didn't show them. He worked from sunup to sundown, mending fences, hauling hay, teaching Henry how to shoulder the weight of a man's chores too soon. At supper he spoke little. When he did, it was plain words about weather or cattle prices, never questions about her past. Clara both feared and craved those questions. The silence left too much room for her thoughts. One evening, as the younger children slept, she found herself beside him on the porch. The night air smelled of pine, pitch and dust. Crickets sang steady in the grass. "You didn't ask me where I came from," she said finally. Elias didn't look at her. "Don't need to know where you've been, only care where you're standing now." His voice was quiet but firm, like the way he handled the reins. And though he said no more, she felt something shift. He wasn't a man to pry, but neither was he blind. The first time Clara ventured into town with Elias, whispers followed like burrs sticking to wool. Women gathered on porches stiffened when she passed. Men leaned back in chairs outside the saloon, tipping hats with smirks that carried memory. Someone hissed her name, Boone's girl. Her stomach knotted. She kept her eyes on the ground. At the general store, Mrs. Abernathy, A sharp-tongued widow eyed her basket and said, "Didn't figure we'd see you again after what happened." Elias stepped forward, his shadow falling long across the counter. "She's with me now," he said, simple, final, but Clara could feel the judgment pressing in. Rumors traveled faster than stagecoaches, and in towns like this, once a reputation stuck, it was near impossible to shake off. Back on the outskirts of town, another shadow was stirring. Harlan Boone had woken from his drunken stupor the morning Clara vanished to find his house empty. At first he laughed, certain she'd come crawling back before sundown, hungry and desperate. But days passed, then the laughter turned to rage. "She's mine," he spat to anyone who'd listen. "Ain't no one steals what's mine." And when word reached him that she'd been seen riding into town on Carter's wagon, his fury sharpened. Elias Carter, the widower, the fool with too many mouths to feed. Harlan told himself it wasn't jealousy, but deep down it burned like whiskey down his throat. Back at the ranch, Clara tried to prove her worth. She mended torn shirts, cooked bread that filled the cabin with warmth, soothed the baby through fever. Slowly the girls began to soften. Even Henry grudgingly accepted her when she showed him how to mend a broken strap on his saddle. But night still brought doubt. Lying on her cot, she whispered prayers to a God she wasn't sure heard her anymore. She prayed for courage, for belonging, for a chance to outlive her own shame. And then came the night of the knock. It was late, the kind of silence where even the crickets give up. The baby had finally drifted to sleep. Clara sat by the fire, darning socks, when the sound came. Knock, knock, slow, deliberate. Elias rose, lantern in hand, his jaw tightened. "Stay with the children," he told Clara, voice low. But she already knew. Her bones recognized the rhythm of that knock. Harlan Boone. Through the window she caught a glimpse. Broad shoulders, hat pulled low, a bottle glinting in his fist. Her breath hit. Elias opened the door just enough to speak. "You're on my land. State your business." Harlan's laugh was a growl. "That woman in your house, she's mine, sold to me, proper and legal. I've come to take her back." Clara's hands shook so hard the needle pricked her thumb. Blood welled bright against the fabric. Elias didn't move from the doorway. "She's not yours anymore. She stays." The silence stretched, heavy as thunderclouds. Then Harlan leaned closer, voice dripping with venom. "We'll see about that, Carter. We'll see." When he finally rode off, hooves pounding into the night, Clara knew one thing for certain. The past had found her, and it wasn't finished. Clara had thought survival meant escaping Harlan, but survival was about to mean something else entirely. Standing her ground, and learning whether Elias's protection was enough. When a man like Boone came hunting, by morning, the whole valley knew Harlan Boone had come knocking. Gossip rode quicker than any horse. At the mercantile, at the feed store, even at church, Clara could feel eyes sticking to her like burrs. She ran out on him. No, he sold her off first. "She's cursed, they say, can't bear a child." The words hung in the air, half murmurs, half accusation. Folks didn't speak them to her face, but she heard them all the same. Each whisper pressed like a stone on her chest. Elias, though, moved through town as though nothing had changed. He tipped his hat, bought nails and flour, and loaded the wagon without a flinch. But Clara noticed the way his hand stayed close to his holster, the way his eyes scanned every shadow. He knew trouble wasn't finished. That night on the porch, Elias spoke for the first time about Harlan. His voice was steady, but the firelight carved deep lines into his. "Boone's a mean drunk, but worse when he's sober. He'll twist the law if he can't win with fists. Claims he's got papers saying you're his wife." Clara felt her stomach twist. "He bought me," she whispered. "My parents signed me away like I was cattle." Elias turned toward her, eyes sharp. "Listen to me. A piece of paper don't own you. Not here. Not while you're under my roof." She wanted to believe him. She wanted those words to be iron. But she'd lived long enough to know that sometimes law and truth weren't the same thing. It wasn't just Boone she had to face. It was the children, too. Henry still looked at her with suspicion. Every kindness she offered, a mended shirt, a steady hand at the well, he weighed like coin on a scale. One wrong move and she knew he'd run to Elias with accusations. The breaking point came one afternoon when Clara found him struggling to lift a sack of grain. She stepped forward to help, but Henry jerked back. "I don't need you," he spat. "You're not my ma. You don't belong here." The words cut deep, but Clara didn't raise her voice. Instead, she hefted the sack onto her shoulder and carried it inside without complaint. Later that evening, Henry lingered in the doorway as she kneaded bread. "Why you still here?" he asked, softer this time. Clara wiped flour from her hands. "Because your pa said I could stay, and because I want to." Henry said nothing more, but the next morning, when she set a plate of food in front of him, he didn't push it away. It was the smallest crack in the wall, but a crack all the same. Meanwhile, Harlan Boone wasn't idle. He spent his nights in the saloon, pouring liquor down his throat and spitting venom into willing ears. "She's mine by law," he boasted. "Ran off with Carter, that fool, but I'll get her back. You'll see." He waved papers he claimed were legal contracts. Some men laughed, others nodded, muttering about the rights of property, the rights of men. By week's end, Boone had stirred enough talk that the sheriff couldn't ignore it. Sheriff Langford was an old man, weary of choosing sides. He rode out to Elias's ranch one morning, hat in hand. "Carter," he said, "Boone's making noise, claims the woman belongs to him. I don't hold much with the way he says it, but folks are listening. If this comes to court, it'll get ugly." Elias's jaw clenched. "She's not livestock, Sheriff. She stays." Langford sighed. "Just keep your eyes open. Boone's not the sort to wait on judges." That night Clara sat alone by the fire. She stared at her hands, raw from scrubbing and sewing, and felt the old shame crawling back. What if Boone was right? What if the law dragged her back to him? She had no money, no kin, no proof of freedom beyond Elias's word. The baby stirred in her cradle, fussing. Clara lifted her, rocking her gently. The tiny body melted against her shoulder, warm and trusting. And for the first time in her life, Clara realized something. She might be barren, but she wasn't useless. She could give care, she could give love, even if the world never granted her a child of her own blood. That thought steadied her. It planted something stubborn in her chest. Not hope, not yet, but defiance. It came sooner than expected. One afternoon, as Elias and Henry were out mending fence lines, Clara heard hooves pounding up the road. She stepped outside to see Harlan Boone reining in, 2 men from the saloon flanking him. "Well, well," Boone drawled, sliding off his horse. "There she is, my runaway wife." Clara's heart hammered, but she didn't move. "I'm not your wife, not anymore." Boone sneered. "Don't matter what you say, law says different." He reached for her arm. Before he could touch her, Henry's shout rang out. He and Elias had returned quicker than Boone expected. Elias dismounted in one motion, placing himself between Boone and Clara. "You lay a hand on her, and you'll pull back a stump," Elias said, voice like steel. Boone's men shifted uneasily, hands near their pistols. The air was tight, ready to snap. But Boone only laughed. "Fine, you keep her for now. But this ain't over. Next time I won't come alone." He swung into his saddle and rode off, dust trailing like smoke. His men followed. Elias turned to Clara. For a moment the mask slipped, and she saw the weight in his eyes, the knowledge that war had just been declared. That evening, the ranch was quiet, too quiet. Even the children sensed the danger. Anna and Ruth clung to Clara's skirts. Henry kept glancing at the window, as if expecting Boone's return any second. Elias sat at the table, gun laid out in front of him, polishing it with slow, steady stroke. Clara watched him, a question rising to her lips, but dying before she could speak. Instead, Elias looked up first. "Boone won't stop. He's the kind that don't know when he's beat. We'll be ready." Clara swallowed hard. Ready for what? A fight, a trial, a life forever marked by Boone's shadow. For the first time since she'd left Harlan's house, she wondered if her presence had cursed this family, if her staying meant danger for all of them. But when Maggie crawled into her lap, doll in hand, whispering, "Don't go, Clara." She knew leaving wasn't an option. Not any. Harlan Boone had drawn the battle lines. The law was shifting against her, the town whispering louder, and Clara's place in Elias's home hanging by a thread. And the next time Boone came, it wouldn't be with words, it would be with fire. The days that followed Boone's visit stretched long and tense. Every creak of saddle leather, every hoofbeat on the road made Clara's stomach tighten. The children grew restless, catching the fear in the air though no one spoke of it outright. Elias went about his work with steady hands, but she noticed the changes, the rifle propped by the door, the way he never let the lantern burn low, the way his eyes scanned the tree line at dusk. Boone hadn't just threatened, he was waiting, circling, the way a wolf waits for night before it strikes. It wasn't only Boone's shadow she felt. The town began to turn colder. At church, benches that once had space beside them suddenly filled before Clara could sit. Neighbors who had once nodded with politeness now crossed to the other side of the street. She don't belong with those children. She's Boone's wife, bound by law. She'll bring nothing but trouble down on Carter's head. Clara kept her chin high, but the whispers stung. Every glance reminded her how fragile her place was, how one wrong move could tip Elias into ruin simply for taking her in. And yet, when she saw the way Maggie clung to her skirts, or the baby quieted only in her arms, she felt something steadier than fear, a sense of belonging she'd never tasted before. One evening, the sheriff rode out again. His horse's hooves stirred dust in the yard as the children watched from the doorway. "Carter," Sheriff Langford said, his tone uneasy. "Boone filed papers, claims breach of marital contract, says you're harboring stolen property." Elias's jaw flexed. "She's a woman, not a mule." Langford sighed. "I know, but the judge may not see it that way. Boone's pushing hard. He's got folks talking." Clara stepped forward, hands trembling. "Sheriff, if the law takes his side, what happens to me?" Langford hesitated, eyes downcast. "You'd go back, until court said otherwise." Her breath caught. "Go back, to Boone's house, to his fists and whiskey breath." She'd rather lie in the dirt. Elias's voice cut like a knife. "That won't happen, not while I draw breath." The sheriff gave a weary nod, tipped his hat and rode off, leaving silence heavy in his wake. That night, Clara found Elias on the porch, staring into the dark. "You should have let me go," she whispered. "Boone's trouble is mine, not yours. I've brought it to your door." Elias turned slowly. "You think I took you in out of pity? I've buried one wife. I know what it means to be alone with children who look at you like you're all they've got left. You were running. I saw that, but you're not running now. You're staying." Something in his voice rooted her deeper than the walls around her. For the first time, Clara believed she wasn't just hiding here. She was wanted. The first blow came 3 nights later. It was near midnight when Clara woke to the smell of smoke. At first she thought it was a dream, until she heard Henry shouting from outside. "Fire! Fire by the barn!" She scrambled up, dragging the girls with her. Out the window she saw it, flames clawing at the sky, the barn engulfed, horses screaming inside. Elias was already out the door, rifle in hand. Clara rushed to the children, gathering them close in the yard. Sparks rained, the heat pressing against her face. She saw shadows at the tree line, riders, Boone's men, watching the fire burn. "Stay with the children," Elias barked, racing toward the barn doors. Clara didn't think. She shoved the girls behind her and sprinted after him. The smoke seared her throat, but she threw her weight against the latch with Elias. Together they forced it open, the terrified horses bolting free into the night. The barn collapsed minutes later, flames devouring everything inside. From the ridge, Boone's laughter echoed. "That's just the start, Carter." Then the riders vanished into the dark. By dawn the barn was nothing but ash and charred beams. The family stood in silence, eyes red from smoke and fear. The children clung to Clara, refusing to let. Henry's voice broke first. "What if they come back?" Elias's hand rested heavy on his son's shoulder. "Then we'll be ready." But Clara knew this was no longer about readiness. Boone had crossed from threats to war, and she was the reason Elias and his children stood in its path. That night, when the children were finally asleep, Clara sat at the table with Elias. Her voice was steady, though her hands shook. "He won't stop. You know that. He'll burn everything, take everything, just to prove he can." Elias met her eyes, calm as stone. "Then we'll fight." Clara swallowed. "This isn't your fight, it's mine. I should leave." Elias leaned forward, his gaze fierce. "You walk out that door, he wins. You stay, we fight together. My children need you, and I don't aim to lose another woman I care for." Her breath caught. It wasn't a declaration of love, not yet. But it was enough. Enough to root her feet to that floor, to tie her fate to his. The next morning something shifted. Henry, who had been cold and distant, approached Clara while she drew water. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes tired but clear. "I saw you last night," he said. "You ran into the fire with Pa. You didn't have to." Clara lowered the bucket. "You're right, I didn't have to, but I couldn't let him face it alone." Henry nodded slowly. Then for the first time he handed her the rope, letting her draw the next pail with him. It was small, but it was trust, real trust, and it meant more to her than words could say. But Boone wasn't finished. 2 days later, word reached them from town. Boone had filed another petition, this time claiming not just Clara, but custody over Elias's children, arguing the Carter homestead was unsafe. Clara froze when she heard it. The law wasn't just coming for her now. It was coming for the children. The town was dividing fast, some siding with Elias, others whispering Boone's poison, and as the lines hardened, one truth burned clear. The final confrontation wasn't far off. The barn was gone. The town was turning, and now Boone wasn't just threatening Clara's freedom. He was threatening to tear Elias's family apart, piece by piece. The next strike wouldn't be fire, it would be something worse. The valley felt heavier with each passing day. Boone's fire had taken the barn, but not his hunger. Now he was after more. Not just Clara, but Elias's children. Word spread that he'd filed a petition claiming Carter's homestead was unsafe for minors. "Widower, half-starved kids, and a barren runaway," he crowed in the saloon. "Judge'll see sense, once I put it plain." The whispers reached Clara's ears like nails scraping glass. For nights she lay awake, listening to the wind rattle the shutters, wondering if the law would betray her again. But Elias never faltered. He fixed the corral, rebuilt fences, and each evening sat with the children around the table as though the world wasn't closing in. That steadiness, more than anything, became her anchor. The showdown came on a blistering August afternoon. A circuit judge rode into town with the sheriff, dusty from the trail but stern-eyed. Boone wasted no time dragging him into the saloon, slapping papers on the table, shouting about contracts and rights. By the next morning, the judge called a hearing in the church hall. Every soul in town showed up, curious as crows. Clara sat beside Elias, the children huddled close, while Boone swaggered in, drunk with confidence. "She's my wife," he bellowed, waving the contract. "Bought and paid for, fair and square. And Carter here's got no right harboring another man's property. He's endangering them children too, setting fire traps on his land." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, others scowled. The judge's face stayed unreadable. Elias rose. His voice was calm, but it carried. "She's not property, she's a woman. Boone treats her like an animal. Worse. I'll not hand her back. And as for my children, they're fed, clothed and loved. Can Boone say the same of anything he touches?" The judge's eyes flicked to Clara. "Speak plain. Do you claim this marriage?" Her throat tightened. All eyes bore down. This was the moment the law could turn against her. "I claim nothing of Boone," she said, steady though her heart raced. "He bought me, yes. My parents sold me, yes. But God himself wouldn't bind me to a man who beat me, spat on me, and left me less than dust. If you send me back, Judge, you're sending me to die." The silence that followed felt like the world holding its breath. Boone's face went red as fire. "Lies. he roared, shoving past the pews. "She's mine." He lunged forward, hand at his pistol. The sheriff shouted, "Boone, don't." But it was too late. Guns came up. The church hall erupted in screams as men ducked. Women dragged children beneath benches. Elias was on his feet in an instant, shielding Clara and the little ones. Boone's pistol cleared leather, but before he could aim, Henry, shaking but fierce, stood up from the front pew. "Leave her alone," the boy shouted. For a split second, Boone hesitated, sneer twisting into something crueler. He aimed at Henry. That's when Clara moved. She threw herself forward, grabbing Boone's arm with both hands. The gun fired wild, the shot tearing through the rafters. Smoke filled the room, shouts rising. Boone snarled, backhanding her hard, but she didn't let go. She clawed at his wrist, teeth bared, dragging the barrel away from Henry. Elias's fist came next, a brutal strike that sent Boone crashing against the pulpit. The pistol skittered across the floor. Before Boone could scramble up, the sheriff was there, rifle leveled. "Enough. Boone, you're finished." The church fell into stunned silence. Clara stood trembling, cheek stinging where Boone had struck her, but her grip on his arm had left bruises of her own. She hadn't run this time. She'd stood her ground. The judge rose slowly, voice cold as stone. "I've seen enough. This contract Boone waves means nothing but wickedness. A woman is no man's property. And as for the children, their place is with Carter, not with a drunk who sets fire to another man's barn. Boone, you'll answer for arson, assault and attempted murder." The crowd gasped. Some nodded in grim approval. Others shifted uncomfortably, but none dared protest. The sheriff bound Boone's hands, dragging him out into the dust. His curses echoed down the street until the doors shut behind him. When the hall emptied, Clara sat weak on the pew, the children clinging to her skirt. Henry's face was pale, but his eyes were wide with something like awe. "You saved me," he whispered. Clara brushed his hair back, her voice breaking. "No, Henry, we saved each other." Elias knelt beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. For the first time, the hardness in his gaze softened into something else, gratitude, respect, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. "You didn't run," he said quietly. She shook her head. "I won't. Not anymore." The weeks that followed were quiet. Boone was hauled out of town in shackles, his threats silenced. The ranch still bore scars, the ashes of the barn, the whispers that hadn't fully died. But within the Carter home, something new had taken root. Henry no longer looked at Clara like an intruder. He worked beside her, shoulder to shoulder. The girls trailed after her with laughter instead of whispers. Even the baby reached for her with trust only a mother could earn. And Elias, though his words remained spare, his presence carried warmth now. When he sat beside her on the porch in the evenings, silence between them felt less like distance, more like belonging. Now maybe you're wondering, was that the end of Clara's troubles? Did the world suddenly forget she'd once been sold, branded barren, and cast aside? No, folks don't forget easy. But here's the truth, she wasn't barren at all. Not in the ways that mattered. She bore something stronger than children: courage, loyalty, the stubborn kind of love that binds strangers into family. And sometimes that's enough to change a man, change a house, change the whole way a town whispers about a woman. Because when the storm finally broke, Clara didn't run. She stood. And from that day on, no one dared call her cursed again. Suspense delivered, promises fulfilled. Boone's final move, Clara's choice. Elias's family defended, and Clara's true belonging sealed.